Hello, Dr. Lewis here with our chronic disease temperature, and we're going to focus on biomarker number 1, insulin, or really fasting insulin. And once again, the focus is on insulin in the blood and at what level do we start to see an increase in early all-cause mortality in populations. So first of all, what does insulin do? So insulin's a hormone, and hormones regulate the functions of our body. And insulin has really one big job, probably has a bunch of little jobs, but it has one big job. Keep your blood glucose levels within a narrow range. So a narrow range. Why? Just like with oxygen, we evolved and adapted to this narrow range. And anything too low, our cells are starving. Anything too high, glucose contributes to inflammation, and chronic inflammation is really at the root of so many diseases because it's affecting the health and quality of our vessels. So in a perfect world, human cell needs some energy, glucose is in the bloodstream, insulin comes along, pushes it in, everybody's happy. But what happens in America particularly, and in westernized civilizations, is our cells are largely full all the time because of the frequency of what we eat and the energy and the quick absorption of the foods we're eating. So glucose builds up in the bloodstream. But once again, insulin is out here, and insulin's job is to lower glucose to a good range. And so it knows that this human cell in the past has taken glucose, so it tries it again. But the cell resists. It says, stop, I'm already full of glucose. And so when we do this once in a while, feast or famine, everything's okay. We gain a little weight, and we use that excess fat, excess calories that was stored as fat when we need calories when we don't have a ready supply of food. When we do this on an hourly or daily basis, we're going to create something called insulin resistance, which is simply the cell recognizes too much glucose attempting to enter the cell, and it begins resisting the pushing of the insulin, creating insulin resistance. But the insulin's not done. It doesn't just give up and say, well, I'll wait till you're empty again and fill you up. It does other things. It's trying to clear the glucose. And by the way, the ideal value for insulin is 2 to 4. The standard of care has a very wide range compared to our normal range, which is a mortality barometer. Theirs is 2.6 to 24.9, quite a difference. So here's the problem. Excess glucose is not of use to the healthy cell, circulates in the bloodstream. Insulin pushes the glucose anywhere it can. To cancer cells, for example. Cancer cells are highly metabolic. They'll take the glucose. And fat cells, it's part of a natural process, putting excess fuel into the freezer for later use. But the problem is, some of it's not all going to fat, it's going to cancer cells, and it's also feeding pathogens in our body. Bacteria, viruses, and other pathogens thrive on your excess glucose. So that's where the rub comes in. So we know, particularly I'm talking about type 2 diabetics, they have a lot more vascular complications, they have more cancer, and this largely explains why that's happening. So let's look at a mortality curve. Here we have a chart of cumulative mortality. So as we go up, mortality increases over the course of time by what are called the insulin quartiles. And this would be insulin at our ideal range of between 2 and 4. But you can see that in quartile 2 and 3, at an insulin of 6.4 to 9.3, way within the standard of care, we see a jump in mortality. And when we go above 13.5, which is still well within the standard of care, we see a significant jump in mortality. So there's your mortality curve, and we believe based on this curve and others of similar findings in the research medical literature that the ideal range is between 2 and 4 for your fasting insulin number. So here's another complication. So when our body sees a need to lower glucose levels, we produce more insulin. But oftentimes we tap out on insulin and medicine gives exogenous or external insulin. Well, the body's smart enough to realize that both glucose is inflammatory, but so is insulin. So too much of a good thing is not good, so it stops producing it, but yet we give more. And at the end of the day, what happens is exogenous, external insulin actually further increases diabetes complications and further increases all-cause mortality. So external insulin, insulin therapy, not a good thing from a long-term health perspective, particularly regarding mortality. Your numbers may look good, but that does not necessarily mean you're healthy when you're artificially lowering your glucose and you're not looking at insulin. So what we see for insulin for early mortality in a broad array of studies is a U or J curve, very common in healthcare. For example, your blood pressure, you don't want your blood pressure too low, you don't want it too high. That's a U or a J curve. And we see that in fasting insulin. In this study, the people were generally of poor health, so they needed a little bit more insulin to get their cells energized. So really, for healthy people, we want to be lower than the 7.1, which they call their reference point. But this is what we see. And of course, when you go to this end of the spectrum, we see an increase in mortality because we're talking about potentially type 1 diabetics. So this is actually not an all-cause mortality, but a cancer mortality curve for fasting insulin levels. So that's your chronic disease temperature for biomarker 1, insulin or fasting insulin. And the take-home story here is that the standard of care is 24.9 level for the upper limit of normal for insulin, is way into a regime where good scientific and medical studies show an increase in all-cause mortality compared to insulin levels much lower, where 2 to 4 is the ideal range. Dr. Tom Lewis here with the Chronic Disease Temperature. Thank you very much for your time. Take care.